Okay, so I have gotten my code kind of mostly where I want it. I'm still working on a little bit of the documentation, but I feel like it's enough to where I can at least show you. And the one thing I want to preface this by saying is something that Jess asked me in week 6 attendance, and it was a really good question about when I say adding major functionality. Or additions, like you might change something in the way it functions or adding new additions, that he was saying, can I give us a list of suggestions? It's like it's kind of hard to do that because you all have selected such different things to code, that one of the things I would say is based on my selected content, I'm going to show you what I thought made sense. And then this is where I highly recommend you come talk to me so that if you're in question about what you could add based on what you're doing, again, if you're taking Dev Zero or if you're changing a completely different topic, this is where coming to talk to me will help. But what I'm about to show you is my idea of what I took from my Dev 1 to add some major functionality. And what I did, as I said before, is my functionality is actually new. Stuff we haven't seen in this course. So in this video, I'm just going to go over it. But I love to chat about this, so come see me. I did add a line here that just talked about make sure, right, you're writing your own code here. If you are getting inspired or getting code from somewhere, make sure you give a reference so that that reference can be looked at, so that we understand what's yours and what you use maybe from somewhere else. It's just a practice you need to get into. And did want to clarify that on the functions, right? You want to, again, I talked about, I think most of us will use procedural functions instead of OOP. Definitely feel like Dev 2 is going to be OOP implementation, object oriented programming, for whatever your concepts is. For me, I'm pretty sure I'm going to take this same concept in there. But what I want to say here is definitely document them and, have at least a couple examples where you use return values. Okay, and the rest of this is what I had talked about before. So I'm going to go ahead and move over to my code. I have a breakpoint set right inside what I call the initialization function, because I like to have all of my code whenever possible setting inside of a function. I am referencing a global file that is set up at the top of my document as a reference to a physical file here, and I'll show you how that gets populated. I do import JSON so it can help me write has methods for writing and handling JSON files. OS for the path, something we've seen with clear, and which is regular expressions, which I use to validate. Okay, so I use some global and constants, and then of course everything else is setting in a function, which I would hope to see in your code. So let me go down here and I'll tell you, it'd be great too to have you walk through your code using some kind of debugger tool, because it just helps you kind of go over it. So I'm going to go ahead and run my code here. Ooh, how about we run it here? So now I'm going to hit run and debug, and it's stopping right here. Hasn't run this. There's no, this is just a variable that references the file. So let's go see what happens in CheckFile. So CheckFile does something really fun, which in this case, it calls absolute path based on a method and a method, right? Actually, it's not a method, it's a method, and I believe in this case, attribute. No, it's a method. Yeah. So what it does is it called absolute path on the actual file. And in this case, it's calling on the file that it's running. And then what comes out of that is two variables, the directory name and the file name. And so I'm not using file name, which is main, but I do want the directory. So when I call split and it returns two strings, I'm not using the other one. So what I would do is just underscore. This is a very Pythonic way of doing things. That's a term you may hear the more of this stuff you listen to or you hear talked about. So all I'm doing here is getting the directory name. Now, why I'm doing this is directory names are referenced different based on your OS, and this allows you to get a reference based on your a particular OS. So it doesn't write OS specific code. So now I'm going to step into this line, which basically just then I actually could use a whole F string here, but I didn't. Like I said, the dir name, directory name, and then this is the actual name of the JSON file, and it does need the JSON extension. So now that's stored in this entry. But what I have to do here is see, does the file exist, right? And I call OS path is file with that reference. So what it does, it checks to see if that file exists. If it does exist, which in my case it does, I showed this to you before. Here's my a JSON file. It's a dictionary with its first key is EV entries, and then that value is a list of dictionaries. So it is a nested, and that is one of, now you can nest these differently than I do. This is just how I did it, and it really more is conforming with JSON, the JSON formatting requirements. So then if it doesn't exist, this is where I actually have to go create it. And so if I deleted this file, this is where you would see this code run. It sets up a string with, again, this idea of the dictionary with a value, and that value is a list. So this is the blank file, and then it opens this with a W for writing to it. And this is then referred to as the file. And then it does a JSON dump, which is a method to dump that string into there, and then it returns this. Now at this point, all it's doing is writing the file. Okay, if it doesn't exist, and in either case, it returns this reference, and that's really what I wanted. Okay. So now that I have the file check, now I actually get the current email, and I'm running a regular expression here. This is my other major functionality that I added. So regular expressions are great. I love them. And think about trying to validate that if somebody's giving you a valid email format, the validation is can be fairly involved. And regular expressions allow you to set up a string that does a pattern match. I used the method match, but there's other ones you can do on regular expressions. And it breaks it into segments the way I've written it here. It says in these positions, it's looking for a word from either the 1st to the 20th. That's the maximum number of the first part of the user of the email at, and then another word for this between 2 and 20. Okay, that tells you how long that domain can be, and then what we call top level domain. And so this string is a pattern, and it's going to check that user email against there. And if it's valid, it's going to say valid, and it returns. Else it just says it's not valid, and it just continues asking. The program will not run until you get a valid email. So we'll just get out of here, and then, by the way, I'll just show you this. If I hit it'll actually, it's going to actually make you show it. It's not valid. Okay, cool. So we'll do it again, and now I'll do it correctly. Now, this doesn't actually see if it's an active email. That's actually a whole other check. So in this case, it's going to run through, and it's going to go, yeah, now it's valid. And now it returns that email string so that I can use it elsewhere. I give some more output saying, hey, I pulled some of my constant values. Now I'm going to ask the user, right? Do you want to input user track data? And I'm going to say yes. Now, by the way, here I could have put a lowercase or an uppercase yes, again, validating making sure I'm getting the right input. So now while I have a good input, I'm going to ask for the home. And this are the location, and this is where you see my first implementation of a try except block, right? So you're gonna, and this is how this reads. Again, I'm not telling you to write one. I'm just telling you for my needs, it really made life easier to do validation. You can do validation the way we've seen in this course, totally okay. So it gets the validation. It calls to lower. It says while LOC is not is log not in, right? It's not one of these, right? Then print this again, but inside of here, it's actually trying to ask for the input again. And if it gets the wrong one, it actually throws what's called a value error. And this is kind of a global exception. As like if you get any kind of error, you can either rise a value, which says, hey, if I find this kind of error, do this, or you can actually do that type of error right here. Now, again, I'm just kind of giving you the low 20,000 foot view here. So now if I hit home, right? Now, because I've called to lowercase, right, and it is valid, it is in there, then it brings back location. I am going to need location. Now is stored in charge loc. And if it's D, which means I'm done, which in this case it wasn't, then I'm going to go get miles. And so in this case, I'm going to run through, I'm going to set some strings in order to kind of make my input PEP 8 compliant. It was just easier to do it this way. I realized later I could have done it a lot easier. Here's where I'm going to actually give it a value, and it's telling me it has to be between 1 and 270, which is my battery limit. So I'm going to say 200, right? And now it's going to try to throw an int. It's going to say, can I convert the input to an int? And if you can't, that means you didn't get the right kind of, and this is, again, I'm using a try except block to do validation, okay? That's, and so what it says, I'm going to try this. If it throws an error, I'm going to say, enter a number to continue. It's just going to repeat this loop, right? And it continues through here again. Otherwise, it breaks out of that. Okay, so that's how I handled the validation there. And then I return miles, right? From get miles, I return miles. So now I can call my calculation here with my location, with my miles, and with my current email. And this is where we're actually now going to write. I'm going to set the cost, right? I've passed these in. Here's my doc strings. I'm going to calculate my cost. I'm going to round it. Part of the way this formula is put together is because I need miles. So it says this is a constant. It subtracts that from miles. Part of this is kilowatts based on location, has different kilowatts, has different cost. So it determines that cost, tells you, yeah, we captured it. Then it sets up an entry, which we can see is a dictionary entry here. You can see the entries in here, and now we're actually going to go and save to file this new entry. So I'll show you how that works. There we are. So I set up one little function just to call the other two because I wanted to separate out the logic of reading, okay, the logic to writing. And it's very common when you're doing this kind of reading and writing of files that you do separate out the reading and the writing. So the first thing we're going to do, because we got that entry passed, right, that new entry that I just entered with all the associated key value pairs. Now I'm going to read. I'm going to try, and this again, try except, right? So this time, the only exception I'm looking for is if the file can't be found. Now this should never get thrown because I've checked for it, but I still want to do a try except. There's other errors I could check for, but in this case, I just did kind of a minimal, right? And now it says, and I'm passing this now, we're going to open the entry. Now what this is because this entry file is just a variable that says, and open says I'm actually going to open the file, and from here on out we're going to call it F. Okay, so now I have a file, whatever that file is, I've opened it, and now I'm going to do a JSON load. Okay, so watch what happens here is it now returns all those, right? So remember, when you're reading files from the file system, you're actually not reading them directly. You're dumping everything into something that your code now has reference to in its main memory, and then you go from there. This is why when you're doing physical file, you have to think a little more about this process. So now what I've done is I've pointed to the data, right? The data here that came back, and I said, I only want everything coming in from the EV entries. Now this is where, after I was done, I realized I could have done this so much easier, but that's often what happens. So let's just keep going through. And now I'm just going to call a simple append, because remember that each entry is a entry in the list, so it's an append, and I've done a temporary reference just to the EV entries. Good. And now if there's an error, it throws it. Otherwise, I'm going to return the data. So now I have the data here because I returned it, because I've sent the entry over. I've saved it into the file itself. And now, and actually what I've done here is I've actually saved it to the memory file of my code. So now what I have to do, because I have all my data with my updated entry, now I have to actually write the JSON file. And here's where you do another try except, and in this case, we already have it open right now. We're writing to it. Okay, so again, we're passing the data over. We're opening this. Oh, so this is actually now not the reference to the file. It's actually the file in the program's memory. So now we do the dump, right? So what we say is now open this entry file as a write. We will refer to it as F from now on. Now it's going to say dump all this data, right? And this is how I want you to indent it. And now we go back. Cool. So now we've written that. We could actually track this over here, and we could see that this was the last entry. This was appended into the file. Okay, so let's go back. We're kind of getting close, and we saved it to here. So now we can drop back to our main initialization, right? And now we've done the calculated cost. We've made it persistent. And then this last part, this got a little complicated more, made me realize I really should have done a different job in the way I calculated the stats, but I'll just kind of briefly go over this. And in this case, it's going to ask, do you want to enter more data? In this case, I'm going to hit done. I don't want any more. We're done. I actually want to see my stats. Yeah, break out of here. And now, because remember, here's my loop, I'm going to break out of that, and then I'm just going to run. And I'm just going to kind of run through this real quick. But here's some of the stats I reported. Total number of charging sessions, and this is broken down by whatever email is given, the total cost, and then I broke the average for all charging sessions, and then home sessions and the supercharger sessions. Let me just give you a brief look at this, because this was, like I said, a little more involved than I really wanted it to be, but it was actually kind of fun as well. And this is where I did my charge stats. And then I said with that entry file open, so I had to read it. Okay, I did again had to load it, right? And then called it temporary. And in this case, I had to filter by email, and I used a filter method. I used the lambda function, which is basically a shortcut of a way you can call a function inline. And then I've said what you're iterating over is this temporary file, and then what you're looking at is the email. This is where I'm filtering by email. Then I home filter, super filter, and then if I don't have any data in there, I just drop out, which is what I'd done here. Else I went ahead and I found kind of a quick, easy way, and this is my reference to the one thing I did go get, because it kind of helped me just in a print statement, iterate over and give me a sum of those. Because, oh, by the way, up here, I actually ended up returning a list here, is what the data type that was stored there. So it was just kind of like I said, in hindsight, what I realized at the end is I actually should have done this. And that's what happens. Sometimes you build something, you realize I could have done that so much easier. Is here I would have actually stored the email of the user, and that way I could have just referenced that and grabbed all those. So I'm definitely looking at doing that refactor when I'm done. Okay, so just to show you one of the things, here's what I have. I got to update this, but here's what I ended up doing for my README file so far. This is pretty much what I showed you before. Was I just went over, here's my additional functionality, and you want something in that README file, and then you want to link to your flowchart. And the other thing is, and she showed us this, and I ended up doing a to-do list of what I needed to do. Like this is what I want my to do of my remaining work. maybe not for this session, but what I really want to do is actually do another to-do list. And I'm going to do this of because I did it in my head and I should have done it on here like she showed us to do of task. And by the way I'm doing this is I hit dash, open parentheses, put a space, and then I test one. And then when you render this, it actually gives you a nice little to-do list. And then what you can do is just hit, an X there to show that it was done. It's not the greatest, but it's at least a way to do it. Okay, I know this was fairly fast. How fast was it? How many of you actually got through all this? 20 minutes. I'm interested. So my idea here was just to show you a way to implement two new pieces of functionality. Writing to a JSON file and using a regular expression was my two major things that I did, and why I used it was so I could make my data persistent and I could validate email. Okay, my code is completely PEP 8. And how do I know that? Well, if you look down here, there is no problems in it, which is where you would look for that at. And I didn't use any third party, so I don't have to set up the virtual environment, but I think I probably owe one small video on showing you the user side of that. So I at least hope this gives you at least an idea of how I approached my dev one, and I look forward to seeing yours.